Okay, everyone. I'm back, and now we're going to continue. And what we were talking about, remember, was this problem that we still face about the idea of universal human rights, if we actually believe in them. How do we make them real? And Arendt is really actually following up one of the basic stories of how human rights were supposed to be made real, which is through the birth of national identity and national sovereignty. The nation state was supposed to be based on human rights, and the spread of the idea of the nation state throughout the world, let's say the United Nations that we live in today, was supposed to be the vision of how human rights become real for everyone. Arendt is going to follow up this story of the relationship between identity and rights into essentially a critique of the idea of human rights through what she calls the decline of the nation state. What we're going to do is we're going to essentially replay a lot of what we've already talked about um, in terms of how identities shifted towards the creation of the nation state, and how that went hand in hand with a rethinking of what rights were and how they function. We're going to replay basically that story, and now we're going to do it through the prism of what Hannah Arendt um, says about the idea of universal human rights. So let's go back and just very briefly recap what we said in the last few weeks when we talked about the rise of national identity and the rise of national sovereignty. Remember, I talked about how uh, the reality is that this notion, this idea of national identity, of this equal identity that we all share as peoples who have the right to determine their own fate, right? That this is something relatively new in human history because uh, in the first few weeks of the course, when we were talking about how social identity functioned, um, you saw it was radically different, right? How did people think about identity and rights before the Enlightenment and the French Revolution? Remember, I talked about if we went and asked somebody in the French kingdom in 1500 to tell us about their identity, the last thing they would have said is that I am French. They would have most likely talked about um, their local identity if they were a peasant, the lord that had their name on the territory in which they lived, to whom they owed obligations. Um, if they were somebody who lived in a town, they might have talked about their profession as and their um, whether they were part of a guild, for example. Um, if they were a member of the aristocracy, they would have obviously uh, talked about their privileges and their territory as defining who they were. And all might have talked about being fundamentally Christian. Um, but none of them would have talked about being somehow part of the same people. Uh, the aristocracy that ruled over that mass of peasantry, and the monarchies that came to rule essentially over everybody, they didn't identify with the people that they ruled over. They usually spoke even different languages, had very different customs. The aristocracy was an international class that identified between itself across all territories. Um, and they certainly didn't identify with the people that they ruled over. The great example, I think I've mentioned this before, in the First World War, uh, you have George V of Britain fighting with Tsar Nicholas II against Wilhelm II of Germany, and they're all essentially from this. They're the first cousins. They're from the same German family, right? So really, when we think about identity and rights, uh, previous to the French Revolution and all across the world, we'd have to talk about identity in terms of socialist states, which were defined in terms of privileges. Rights were not what brought everybody together. Rights were what separated people into who they were supposed to be, who they were meant to be. And that meant that if you had a certain right, others did not have it. It was your privilege, essentially, right? Even for those people in the towns who could practice a profession, that was a privilege. It was a right they had that others did not have. And how were these rights and privileges defined? Uh, the reason why ordinary people were talked about as commoners before the French Revolution is that they didn't have any special privileges. That's why they were just commoners, right? But how were these privileges and rights ultimately defined? Well, it was through some religious vision, essentially, of the fundamental order in the universe and in society. That's what gave the elites in society the right to rule over the members in that society. And that's what gave them, in their eyes, the universal right, essentially, to go and to try to conquer as much as they could around the world, because they did it in the name of extending this proper vision of God's order, right? So the same thing that gave the elites the sense of privilege to rule over the ordinary people that with whom they didn't identify, at the same time gave them the sense of legitimacy, essentially, to expand their rule um, across the world in the name of God. So this is why religion was the basis of political legitimacy until the modern world. It defined privilege both internally, and it defined right in terms of the sovereignty of uh, the person trying to amass an empire outside of their society. The two things went hand in hand. Um, how does this shift as we come into the Enlightenment and the French Revolution? Well, this is when, for the first time, the notion of equality, right, of identity as being based on uh, fundamental equality between people emerges. And this is why, initially, the idea of nationality is based on the idea fundamentally of our belonging to the same humanity, having the same human rights and obligations. Because nationality was founded fundamentally initially on the idea of citizenship. And citizenship, as we've seen in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, was based on the idea of the rights of man. So again, why do we have, as the people, the right to rule ourselves? Because this is what fundamentally defines our humanity and our human freedom, right? Our humanity is defined by a freedom which we cannot alienate or give to anybody else, and it's recognized in the rights that we realize through ruling ourselves as part of a people, in creating the general will, in creating a collective will, the national identity, right? And so now, fundamentally, identity based on citizenship comes from being part of the people, and the people ruling itself on the basis of rights that belong to all humanity. So rights are now what we share, what we have fundamentally in common on the basis of our humanity. And how are these human rights supposed to become universal and real and exercised by everybody in the world? Well, to the extent that the people come to exercise their rights, to the extent they come to emancipate themselves, to get their freedom by getting rid of all of those elites and aristocrats who claim special privileges, right? Remember, Sieyès calls those aristocrats the foreigners because they don't identify with the people. They're thinking only about their own interests. To the extent every nation, every people comes to get rid of the foreigners and to emancipate itself and to rule itself, it will come to realize the rights that belong to all human beings in the case of its own people through the rights and obligations of citizenship, right? This was the story of how human rights were supposed to become something that ultimately everybody in the world would have. Through the story of the rise of popular sovereignty, of national sovereignty, um, and so essentially through the idea of the spread of national emancipation and democracy all around the world. Now, uh, one of the interesting things at this point to consider is that uh, in the 19th century, right, once people started actually to think about identity in these national terms, right, in these equal terms, fundamentally, it doesn't matter if I'm a rich French person or a poor French person, if I'm have this occupation or that occupation, if I have this religion or that religion, fundamentally, if I'm a French citizen, I'm French. We're all fundamentally French, or we have another national identity, Italian, Turkish, Arab, whatever it may be. Think of yourself, right? Everybody in the world, through their citizenship, presumably is supposed to have some kind of national identity, some people that they belong to. And in the 19th century, um, many people came to think of these uh, national identities, the sense of belonging, as having been almost ahistorical, as there have always been the French people and the Italian people and the Turkish people and the Arab people, and you had to just go through history and trace. At what point do they actually come to become fully conscious of themselves as having this identity and claiming their right to rule themselves? But as I'm trying to tell you, this is basically a kind of bullshit story because this kind of identity, this national identity itself, is something very, very recent in human history. It didn't really exist before the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, the the political identity of the masses, for the most part, was irrelevant because politics was essentially for the elite. Uh, it's after the French Revolution that the masses enter the political process. They are the ones who are supposed to die for their country, right? And that's the moment in which we start to get this identity, this type of equal identity in which we're fundamentally all the same because we belong to the same people, right? And This means that over the course of the 19th century, the reality was that this kind of national identity was actually created, right? If you went even to the French kingdom at the dawn of the French Revolution, it was made up of many different groups of people who barely could probably understand each other, even when they spoke different dialects of French. Um, they spoke very, very differently. They had very different customs. Um, Identities, again, were incredibly local because empires didn't care about everybody having the same identity. um, that wasn't what that they cared about people paying their taxes, um, and accepting the legitimacy of the people who ruled over them, by accepting the proper religious institutions that made that rule legitimate. Outside of that, they didn't care about people's fundamental identity, and that identity was generally very local. And those localized cultures had very little sense of identity with each other. So even when there was a cultural continuum of different dialects of French, for example, there was no common identity between those people. This is not even to mention the vast differences um, in the French kingdom between, for example, the Bretons, who spoke a completely different language in some sense than other people in the French kingdom. So, what does the creation of the nation state based on citizenship do? It actually, for the first time, starts to create a common cultural identity through the practice of citizenship. It actually integrates and brings people together who had not been together before and had not had the same identity really in the past. So, this kind of nationality that people somehow thought, oh, there have always been the French who've been fighting the English, etc. This is really created in the 19th century. People who are very different from each other are actually, through the practice of citizenship, through common education, through the idea of we're all the same people, brought into the same national identity and culture. And all of the nationalities, really all around the world, are created. They're constructed identities that are not really very, very old. This is why history is so important in the 19th century, because it's by telling a common history, by saying, oh, uh, since Joan of Arc, we've been fighting the English. That's how that kind of national identity is actually created. But like I'm saying, it's actually a kind of identity which is based on assimilating and integrating people who until then had been very, very different, who had been broken up into different classes of people, into different localities, different occupations, and that's how they thought about their identity. And now they come to think about it in this equal sense of belonging to the same people. The case of the Jews is a perfect example of this. By looking at their situation, we get a perfect sense of how the notion of identity and rights are changing over time. Like I said, the rights were defined essentially through the conception of some religious order in the world. That meant that Jews were essentially, until the French Revolution, defined as the outsiders of society, since they didn't share the same Christian identity as the rest of the population. It's in the French Revolution that the Jews are now integrated as citizens into the same French nation, right? Now it said, look, your religion is just your private identity. It's your private belief. You believe whatever it is that you want. But you have to be part of the same uh, identity, the same collective will of French people who have the same rights and obligations. So, on that basis, Jews, like so many of the other groups, are essentially integrated into the same national identity. And the first half of the 19th century is a process of, as you start to get nation states all around Europe, also the emancipation of the Jews. They're essentially becoming citizens like everybody else in the society, right? So this is, you could say, the ideal of how human rights were supposed to become real all around the world. People were integrated, actually assimilated into the sense of being part of the same people. And through that citizenship, they exercise and made real human rights. The Italian example is a really good example because it just shows you, even though people presume that these identities were somehow age old and had been there forever, right? One of the great architects of Italian unification um, says after Italy becomes actually a united kingdom, which we're going to talk about in 1861, he very famously says, "We've made Italy. Now we have to make some Italians." Meaning what? These people are so different from each other. They barely even speak the same language. They don't identify with each other. We've created Italy. Now we have to actually create this common identity. So uh, national identity as being based on citizenship starts out as being a kind of identity which is based on integration, based on assimilating people fundamentally into the same identity, which expresses presumably the rights that we all have as human beings. The big part of the story here that Arendt is trying to tell is, how did this conception of national identity and belonging change actually over the course of the 19th century? Um, the presumption is that once we actually create these nationalities and nation states, once we unify all of Italy, once all of Germany finally becomes unified, um, then we're moving towards this world of the United Nations essentially. And this was an ideal when we left off the history that we were telling. We left it off in 1848, where you started to have national revolutions and democratic revolutions all around the European continent. Let's get rid of all of these dynasties and empires supposedly legitimated by God, and let's create the rule of the people of the nation state coming from our fundamental human rights. This is where we left off the story. What Arendt wants to do is she wants to describe how fundamentally this identity, national identity, didn't remain static. It didn't remain something that was actually defined in terms of assimilation and in terms of citizenship. It's something that changed radically over time. We still live in a world of nation states, but you can just get a sense of this. You can get a sense of how national identity is not necessarily something that has remained static over time, right? If we went 50 years ago and we looked at the world, or even Europe, for example, most people would have fundamentally defined their political identity and their public identity in terms of their national identity, in terms of the passports that they actually had. Um, this is now not necessarily the case as it was 50 years ago. So often, when I go into classrooms and I ask people to tell me who they are or what their background is, they have all of these hybrid identities. I'm Brazilian, French, I'm Moroccan, German, etc. Right? That is relatively that new. It's not something that people, even if that was the reality, and it very often was, um, people would never have talked about their identity generally in that way. It's partly because of the shift in the nature of national identity now, for example, in our case in IE, where we're in a world where you guys are coming from so many different places in Europe and in other places in the world, And think about the university that we're in. The job of the universities until recently was essentially to create national culture, to take whatever was happening scientifically and culturally all around the world and to create a kind of national microcosm of it. Yet here we are at IE, we're in Spain, and I'm talking to all of you in English, right? This itself suggests the rise of new types of identity, global identities. This is why there are all of these hybrid identities that are emerging. The idea of supranational identities, like the European identity, for example, right? Which this is not to say that this global identity or this European identity matches everybody's sense of identities today around the world. For many people, it's the exact opposite. Um, for many of the people who don't, like most of you, have the privilege to be traveling in this way all around the world and to think of yourselves as global people, they stick to their national identity now, maybe even more than they would have in the past. But even this shift, the possibility of thinking of yourself as a European rather than simply as French or German, or thinking of yourself in more global terms, what IE constantly tells you to think of yourself as a global citizen, this conception, right? This in itself is something new that certainly did not exist a few decades ago. The fact that we have the university that we do is itself a sign of this shift in the nature of nationality and national identity. And what Arendt is doing is actually providing a picture of talking about how did this national identity actually change over the course of the 19th century. Where did it go after it was initially based on integration and assimilation through citizenship? Where we left off in 1848 was, yes, these national revolutions happened, the attempt to create more inclusive democracies in what had been all of these dynastic states uh, that were supposedly based on religious authority, right? But we also talked about, and this is where Marx came in, how all of these revolutions actually failed, right? And they failed because um, there was division within societies as to who the people actually were. Should the people be defined by property and what they've achieved in the marketplace, which is how the bourgeoisie and liberals often talked about it? Um, were the people actually the all of the ordinary people? Um, this was a fight basically that led to the defeat of the 1848 revolutions, the springtime of the peoples, as it was called. But not only that, in 1848, it became very, very clear that this idea of a united nations, the idea of that all the peoples come to rule themselves, well, it's a very nice idea, but actually, all of these nations were competing with each other in the claims that they made over territory, who belonged to the nation, what belonged to the nation and what didn't. So when there's an attempt to create actually a Germany from below democratically in 1848, in the German states, there are fights between the Germans and the Poles. In the Austrian Empire, there are fights between the Hungarians are trying to create their own state. They're fighting with the Croats, who would be part of that territory. The Germans, the Austrian Germans, are fighting with the Czechs. So it very soon very becomes very clear that uh, just because the people rule themselves, this doesn't suggest that nationality is not a principle of rivalry and of competition. And that competition also, alongside the class struggles that Marx talks about, leads to the defeat of the revolutions in 1848. But this doesn't mean the end of the rise towards nationality and the nation state. Quite the opposite. the dynastic states, right, that had been fighting, like Prussia and the Austrian Empire or the Russian Empire, all of these multinational empires that founded their authority on God and were fighting essentially after the French Revolution to try to snuff out this idea of nationality as the basis of politics. In 1848, they win, but very soon after, they realize we cannot continue to base essentially on authority, our authority on something outside of the identity of people with their own state. We need the people to identify with their own state because only on this basis can we mobilize them economically, politically, militarily. And this is the basis of power in the modern world. So even though the dynastic states actually win again over national democratic movements in 1848, slowly after 1848, they come to see okay, we actually, to survive, for our dynasties to survive, we have to weld them with this idea of nationality. And so there is now an attempt after 1848 on the part of those statesmen associated with those kingdoms, with those dynasties, to try to create nation states not from below, which would have actually questioned their legitimacy, the biggest kingdoms in the biggest national areas, try basically militarily to unify these countries, the two great examples being Italy and Germany, fundamentally from above, right? Um, this is a map that shows the process of Italian unification. And you see there's a kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, which is this turquoise blue right here. And this kingdom, slowly through a series of wars with the Austria Hungary, um, uh, and with the smaller states essentially within uh, the Italian peninsula, first creates the Italian kingdom in 1861, right? You see the Kingdom of Italy in 1860. Um, and then it gets Venice through another series of wars with the Austrians, and it gets Rome through a war with the French. And so the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, and this is one of the great architects, the Count of Cavour, right? Uh, Through diplomacy and war, the dynastic state kingdom, the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, redefines itself as a national kingdom. What Louis XVI had essentially refused to do, right? They said, look, you're now the king of the French. He said, no, thank you. I'm the king of France. France belongs to me. Now, the dynastic states actually accept that idea. They try to define themselves as the servants essentially of the nation. The same thing happens in uh, the German states, um, which there had always been the question of uh, Austria, for example, which is also German, and the Austrian Empire, which had played such a large role in the history of all of these German states. Those were the Habsburgs. But uh, there's essentially a smaller Germany created through the Prussian dynasty. The Prussians were the other great kingdom within the German state. And you see, this is a process whereby the Prussians unify through a series of wars, first with the Danish in 1864, then with the Austrians in 1866, finally with the French in 1870, right? This is all the work of uh, the person who becomes the first chancellor of the German Empire. That's Otto von Bismarck. Um, he's the one in the white uniform in the center of this picture. This is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, if you guys have been to Versailles, where the unified German Empire is first declared. And it's basically through the diplomatic and military machinations of Bismarck that the German nation state comes into being. And so there is a kind of redefinition of the idea of national identity, um, since now it's focused not so much on the rule of the people and democratic rule from below through citizenship, but as Bismarck thinks about it, uh, national identity is about national power, the capacity of statesmen to bring all of these people essentially into the same identity and make them identify with the nation rather than other nations that they would have some kind of competition with, right? And that's why he bases the idea of national power on realpolitik. Not all the peoples come to rule themselves, but the peoples who have the power can actually create a common identity with themselves, if need be, at the expense essentially of other nations. And why are the dynasties so interested in doing this? Well, because now they know the danger is not only the people not identifying with uh, the country, right? The problem is now there is the possibility, as Marx talks about it, of working classes identifying with each other across different countries. And that's an even greater danger. So the idea is nationality becomes the way actually of getting people in the territory to identify with the power of their own country and the existing institutions and authorities within them, if we can include them in that way, rather than maybe identifying with people who share their same class position all across Europe or the world. So, national identity comes to be focused increasingly on realpolitik. How do we create national power? It's less and less about citizenship, and more about uh, national power, uh, right? As Bismarck calls it, blood and iron. This is based in a way on a rethinking of the relationship between knowledge and power altogether. Remember, for Kant, also, scientific knowledge, technological prowess, economic productivity, these were the sources of power. Um, that's why he thought ultimately even authoritarian countries would start to move towards enlightenment and um, towards societies that would function according to universal rules and become universally accountable. Why? Because uh, that kind of knowledge simply was much more productive. It made you much more powerful, right? This link of knowledge and power doesn't go away. It's still there. What changes is the idea that somehow this kind of knowledge and power mean the same thing as moving towards universal values, moving towards all of us basically living in the same kinds of democratic societies. Instead, the idea develops that actually power, in a way, is neutral in terms of the kind of values that it can serve, right? Um, if I have a gun, if I have the bombs, uh, I can use that to uh, maybe serve a liberal democracy. But as it becomes clear, I could use that to try to create the idea of a master race as the Nazis, for example, did. So the idea increasingly develops that power, knowledge is power, but power is actually, in a way, neutral between values. It can be used to express any kind of value. Again, that's the sense in which nationality and power and realpolitik fundamentally become about how do you survive in a competitive world rather than about how do we all live in the same democratic world of rule by the people. This is also the context then for the birth of the imperial nation state. Right? By the end of the 19th century, we're living in a world not simply of growing nation states around Europe, but those nation states as increasingly becoming global empires. This is essentially a map of it. And why does this happen? Right? Um, why this rush essentially to empire on the part of the European states by the end of the 19th century? Um, Especially since the idea of the nation state, of the people ruling themselves, would suggest that presumably you would want to allow each people fundamentally to rule themselves. So, on what basis is there this rush on the part of Europeans essentially to take over the rest of the world? And globalization and this sense of uh, it's not some kind of universal world of shared values and democratic self-governance, but that every nation essentially has to compete and get enough power for itself to be able to survive in a world of competing power and of realpolitik, right? This is the context which leads to this attempt at imperial takeover of essentially the globe by the end of the 19th century on the part of Europeans. Um, Not only because industrialization, the rise of nation states, the capacity to mobilize all of the people of the state economically and politically makes this possible for Europeans, but because um, there is actually a process of globalization, the creation of a global market by the end of the 19th century. Really, the market is no longer simply national markets by the end of the 19th century, but it's now this global competition all around the world, um, which increasingly leads European nation states to try to globalize themselves to be able to maintain their own sovereignty and power in the midst of this global economic competition. Why? Well, it's very, very clear that um, if this is not a world simply as Adam Smith thought in which well, we'll just basically have free trade, and so borders to some extent will no longer be meaningful from an economic perspective. But if your power is actually based on the economic and industrial growth of your society. And if you're not capable of it, then you might be taken over by another society. Well, by the second half of the 19th century, increasingly, European states come in the midst of this kind of global competition to erect all kinds of trade barriers between themselves. That's the way in which they can actually protect themselves from this kind of global competition, make sure that they still have some control over their own affairs and their own sovereignty. But then the question is, uh, if everybody is bringing up these barriers, then how can you make sure that if your political power is based on this economic power, that in the future you're going to have actually enough markets, enough resources? Well, by making sure that you can take over as much territory around the world essentially as possible. So the globalization of the market actually leads in a way to attempts on the part of nation states to globalize themselves to make sure that they do have that power in realpolitik terms to survive, to have control over their own fate. Um, because the ones that don't, the countries that don't have that power, right? Uh, Look at this map. Um Countries like the Ottoman Empire or the Persian Empire or China. Um, or you see this part, you see Egypt and the Sudan, which is already taken over by the British in 1900. This is a map of the world in 1900. Well, all of these states are actually incapable of raising their own trade barriers. Uh, they're completely subject essentially to the global market on the terms dictated to them by the European powers. Um, which means they can't actually protect themselves in the context of an economic competition, which they can't possibly win against industrial states. So, what do? They borrow money essentially from Europeans, or they sell them their national resources to try to actually keep themselves going, maintain whatever power they have, try to modernize and develop themselves. But then that increasingly gets them into greater and greater debt to Europeans. And that becomes a byway through which Europeans then actually get more and more power and control within these societies. That is, for example, how Egypt goes from a state that is trying to develop and modernize itself in the second half of the 19th century to essentially becoming a British colony after 1882, right? So we're living now in a world by the end of the 19th century where uh, the world is divided increasingly by these nation states in Europe that are erecting and creating global empires on the one hand, and the rest of the people in the world who have become subject essentially to this process of imperial globalization, which is fundamentally the rest of humanity, the rest of pre industrial humanity. Um, let's look at this world then in 1900. You see all of the green, you see there's so much of it around the world, the light green. Um, some of you probably have already guessed by looking at it on the map, you'll know this is Great Britain. This is the British Empire. The British Empire at its height, which comes a little bit after this, after the First World War, is the largest empire in world history. It has about a quarter of the world's land surface, it has about a quarter of the world's population. If you count all the states that actually are satellites of the British economy, about because that's basically most of South America actually in the 19th century, which sell raw materials and foodstuffs to the British. Um, about a third of the world's people have their fate determined by the British Empire. You see how large the French Empire is in Africa. Africa itself, until 1884, 1884, 1885, only 10% of its surface is actually taken over by European empires. And then there's this, as they call it, scramble for Africa in 1884 85 in the Berlin Conference, where essentially Africa is divided up by all of the powers. And you see what a large area the French have in West Africa. Um, The dark green is the Belgian Congo, which was actually given to the Belgian king as his private property. Um, the Germans have they come very very late to the imperial game, and you see they have these small territories in in East Africa and West Africa and in Cameroon. Um, the Italians have Somaliland and Libya, um, and the Portuguese and the Spanish have the remnants of the old empires that they'd had from the early modern period. Indonesia, what is Indonesia today, was the Netherlands, East Indies that belonged to the Dutch, right? And if you look at all of the rest, like the Ottoman Empire or Persia or Afghanistan or China, really the only reason these countries were also completely penetrated culturally, economically, politically by the European empires, but the reason why they were not colonial and they were not colonized directly is because the Europeans couldn't actually agree on how they would divide them up between themselves. China was thought to be such a large prize that and nobody would allow basically one power to take it over, or the Ottoman Empire in the same way. So different powers carved up different spheres of influence in these countries, but uh, essentially these states were kept afloat mostly because Europeans couldn't agree on how they would divide them up. Now, take this world of imperial nation states and of European empires, um, and let's think about the nature of identity now in this globalized world of empires, in this world of globalized markets. If you are somebody in India who is ruled by the British, or if you are a native Muslim in Algeria, which Algeria was actually annexed to France, so it was actually a département, a direct part of France. A lot of the rest of these areas were protectorates, not directly part of the nation state itself. But let's say even out in Algeria, you are a native Muslim, or you're a native Hindu somewhere in India, or a native Muslim somewhere in India. Are you a citizen of Britain? Are you a citizen of France? You're not. You're actually an imperial subject. There were whole other systems of law that applied to all of the native peoples in all of these areas around the world. So you're ruled by the same government, but you have completely different laws that apply to you, and you're not actually a citizen. What does this do to the nature of national identity? Well, increasingly over time, not only does national identity become about identifying with the power of your country in rivalry with other nation states, it increasingly comes to become something ethnic, something racial. Well, why is it that I am a citizen of Britain, uh, being born in London, and this person in India who's ruled by the same government is not? Well, because I'm white and this person is not, right? This person has to be civilized. Um, so the nature of national identity by the end of the 19th century increasingly moves from being about assimilation on the basis of citizenship, right? On that basis, presumably, everybody around the world as human beings could be assimilated to become a full European. Instead, it increasingly becomes something ethnic, something racial, something exclusive. Not only that, this is a world, like I said, a globalized market where people, uh, we talk about globalization, and we think that we live in a globalized world. But in some ways, the first global era was the era of at the end of the 19th century, uh, where human beings first experienced this kind of global market. And in some ways, it was more global than our world because there was much more labor migration. There was much more freedom on the part of people essentially to go and work in different areas. But that led to some of the very same things that we experience. People come from elsewhere to an area, they go and they compete in the marketplace, and then the locals in that area say, why did you come here? You don't belong here. You're not the right kind of person. You shouldn't be here. You're taking over our jobs. This belongs to us. This doesn't belong to you. You shouldn't be here, right? So, this process of globalization, not only does it lead to imperial nation states of one group of people ruling over another group of people and then defining that rule in racial and ethnic terms, it leads also increasingly to racialization and thinking about identity in ethnic terms all around Europe and the world, precisely in the context of defending yourself from market competition uh, of people coming from all around the world, right? And this is what Hannah Arendt basically, in a way, is talking about. You know, this uh, chapter that we read, the first chapter that we read on the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man, comes in the second book of the origins of totalitarianism. And the origins of totalitarianism has three books. The first one is on anti-Semitism. The second one is on imperialism, and the third one is totalitarianism itself. And the chapter that we're reading comes at the end of the book on imperialism, because what Hannah Arendt is talking about is, how does national identity actually change over the course of the 19th century? Well, it increasingly becomes a kind of exclusive identity. It becomes not about assimilating people on the basis of citizenship, but excluding those who are the wrong kind of people, who don't belong because racially and ethnically they are not the same. And that's the case of anti Semitism, right? Remember, we talked about how the Jews were integrated through citizenship uh, and became citizens of France, eventually of Germany, of all the areas around Europe, um, through precisely the creation of constitutional nation states. Their religion was now said to be a private matter, right? But by the end of the 19th century, you get the opposite reality. Now you get the rise of what comes to be known as anti Semitism, right? A feeling against Jews, but now it's no longer about religion. Now it's fundamentally about the idea that Jews simply ethnically and racially are different from us. It doesn't matter if they speak perfect French. It doesn't matter if they've been here for generations. It doesn't matter if they're completely integrated and doctors and lawyers. They will never be German. They will never be French. Why? They are the wrong kind of people. They have the wrong kind of blood. They are Semites. They belong to a different race. I'll talk a little bit more about Aryans versus Semites, especially once we start talking about the Holocaust, where this idea comes from. It starts initially from thinking in terms of language families, right? And then turns into a racial identity. Um, Jews and Arabs, because Jews spoke Hebrew in the ancient times, and Arabs obviously speak Arabic. These belong to the same language family, Semitic. And this was thought of not simply as being a linguistic reality, but as being a racial reality. I think we talked about this when we talked about the Aryan civilization in India, right? So now there's this attempt at not the integration of people on the basis of citizenship, but increasingly the exclusion of people in racial and ethnic terms as nationality comes to be defined in these racial, ethnic, and exclusive terms. Well, this is where we're going to end the discussion as for the background, essentially, to Hannah Arendt's um, analysis of what she calls the decline of the nation state and the end of rights of man, which she does by talking about what happens after the First World War. But you can understand the First World War essentially as emerging out of all of these dynamics. It comes out of imperial rivalry between all of these nation states, particularly between Germany and Britain. Britain, which was the great industrial hegemon essentially in Europe and the rest of the world in the 19th century. This is where industrialization starts. In the middle of the 19th century, the British basically are responsible for almost half of industrial production all around the world. But by the First World War, the Germans actually have passed the British in industrial power. But look at that map in 1900. Look at how much imperial territory Germany has versus how much Britain has. And this is the source of all of this imperial rivalry, right? Of the Germans being worried that um, if they don't, for example, have access to markets, then they will never be able actually to become politically powerful in the way that they are economically powerful. The British being very worried that the Germans are overtaking them economically. And then this is the basis of political power. So if that happens, um, that means that they will ultimately lose the imperial hegemony that they have all around the world. This is what leads the British to basically make a pact with what had been their two great imperial rivals in the 19th century, the French and the Russians, basically to try to contain Germany. Um, and uh, a world in which those multinational empires, like the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire, uh, are fighting basically to maintain themselves in the context of this world, which is increasingly being turned over in the image of national identity, right? And how does the First World War then start? Um, Essentially through Serbians who had their own kingdom wanting to also have the Serbians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire become a part of the kingdom, and the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, the person who was supposed to become the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. This starts the chain of events of Austria-Hungary being afraid of losing its own power in the context of all of these national rivalries within its own empire, and the fight between the British and the Germans and their imperial rivalry. And this is the context essentially of the First World War. So you see how that ideal of the springtime of the peoples in 1848 by 1914 has led to a context of imperial and national rivalry, which leads to the First World War. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And now we basically have the background to talk about what Hannah Arendt says about the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man.